My father told the woman plain, before she'd even set her carpetbag down on the porch boards. She was hired help and nothing more, and if any of us children took to calling her mama, she'd be gone by the first thaw. I was 12 that autumn, old enough to feel the cruelty in it, and too young to name what it cost him to say it. She stood there in the cold wind coming down off the sweetgrass hills, a small woman in a gray traveling dress gone thin at the elbows, her bag in both hands, and she looked at my father the way you'd look at a horse that bites, not afraid of it, just careful. Behind me the door hung open and my little brother Tom clung to the frame, 5 years old and half wild, and my sister Lucy peered out from under my arm, and the wind carried the smell of the coming snow. "I understand you, Mr. Barrett," the woman said. Her voice was low and even. "You want the house kept and the children fed and their clothes mended. I can do that." "That's the whole of it," my father said. "There's a room off the kitchen. You'll take your meals after the young ones are down, wages first of the month." He looked at her a long moment and something moved behind his face and then went still, the way water stills over a stone. "My wife is a year in the ground. I'll not have her place filled. You mind that and we'll get on." "I'll mind it," she said. That was Adelaide Vance, though we didn't learn her Christian name for a week because my father never used it, and she never offered it, and for those first days she was only the woman to us, a gray shape moving through the cold rooms of a house that had forgotten how to be warm. I am an old man now, older than my father ever got to be, and I have buried more people than I care to count, but I can still see her standing on that porch as clear as I see my own hands. I have thought a great deal in the long evenings about the shape a family takes when grief has hollowed it out, and about the woman who came with nothing of her own and taught us how to be filled again. This is the truest thing I know how to tell, and I mean to tell it straight. You have to understand what the house was before she came. My mother, Ruth Barrett, died on a bright cold morning in October the year before, when the fever came through the high country and took the weak and the old, and that once, a strong young woman who had never been sick a day in her life. I was there. I held the basin. I have never told anyone what that room was like, and I won't now, except to say that when it was over my father walked out into the yard and stood with his hat in his hands and his back to the house for the better part of an hour, and when he came back in, some part of him had gone out to the barn and never come back. He was not a soft man before, but he was not a hard one either. I remember him laughing. I remember him swinging Lucy up onto the mare, and I remember the winter nights before, all of us close around the stove while my mother read from the one book we owned and my father whittled and then reached over to touch her hair as if to make sure she was still there. After she died, all of that stopped as though a door had been shut on it. He worked. Lord, how he worked. He was up before light and out past dark, mending fence that didn't need mending, running the cattle down off the high pasture, splitting wood until the woodpile stood taller than the smokehouse. And when he came in at night, he ate what there was and said little and went to his bed, and in the morning he was gone again before we woke. We ran wild. I did my best with Lucy and Tom because there was no one else, but I was 12 and I did not know how to make bread that didn't come out of brick, and I did not know how to get the stains out of Lucy's one good dress, and I did not know how to answer Tom when he woke crying in the night and asked where Mama had gone, only to hold him until he slept and to feel my own throat close so tight I could not have answered if I'd known. The house went gray. The windows went unwashed. There was always a cold draft somewhere, and always something burning on the stove or gone rotten in the crock, and the three of us grew thin and sharp-elbowed and quiet, the way children go quiet when there is no one asking after them. It was the neighbor woman, Mrs. Pauline gets from the bar across down the valley, who finally shamed my father into doing something. She rode up one Sunday in September with a basket of preserves, and found Tom playing in the yard with no shoes and Lucy's hair matted to her head, and the house behind them like a house nobody lived in. And she went and found my father at the wood, and she gave him what my grandmother would have called a piece of her mind. I heard some of it from the barn. Amos Barrett, that woman would not know you, she said. She would not know these children. You've laid down in that grave with her and left 3 living souls up here to fend, and it is a sin, and I'll not soften it. Get help in. Get a woman in this house to keep it and feed these babies, or so help me I'll have the county out here. My father said nothing that I could hear. But 2 weeks later he rode into Ashfork and paid to put a notice in the paper there, and in the one at the county seat. Wanted. A capable woman to keep house and mind 3 children, wages fair, references required. Apply to A. Barrett, the Rockin' Bee on the Sweetgrass, and one gray afternoon in the last of October, near a year to the day since my mother died. The stage let a small woman off at the Ashfork Road, and she walked the last 4 miles up to our place carrying everything she owned in one bag. And that is how Adelaide Vance came to us. She had answered from 2 counties over. She had no husband and no children, and we would learn, no family at all, raised from a baby in a home for orphans back in the States, then passed from one situation to another, a hired girl her whole life, keeping other women's houses and minding other women's children and moving on when the children grew or the situation soured. She was near 30, and she had never in her life had a place that was her own. My father did not ask her much of that. He asked for her references, which were good, and he told her the law of the house, and she took the room off the kitchen, and that was the beginning. I did not like her. I want to set that down honestly, because it matters to what came after. I was the oldest, and I remembered our mother the best and the sharpest, and it seemed to me a kind of treason that this gray stranger should stand at my mother's stove and cook in my mother's pots and sleep under my mother's roof. Tom was too little to remember much. Lucy remembered, but she was 8, and 8 is young enough to be hungry for a warm hand no matter whose it is. But I remembered everything, and I set myself against her from the first day, and I was cold to her the way my father was cold to her, and I told myself it was loyalty. She did not seem to hold it against me. That was the first thing that got under my guard, though it took a long while. She never scolded me for my coldness and never tried to buy me with sweetness. She simply did her work and did it well and let me be. And she was good at the work. I'll say that. Within 3 days the windows were clean and the light came into the house again, and the drafts were stopped with rag and mud where the chinking had failed, and there was bread on the table that rose and browned the way bread is meant to, and a pot of something on the stove that filled the whole house with a smell that made my stomach ache with wanting. She mended our clothes by lamplight after we were meant to be asleep. I saw her, through the crack of the door, bent over Lucy's torn hem with a needle, her face tired and patient in the lamp glow, and she darned socks we'd worn holes clear through, and she made over one of the dresses she'd brought into a smock for Lucy, cutting up her own good dress to do it, though I didn't understand that at the time. She got Tom to eat. That was no small thing. Tom had gone thin and finicky in the bad months, would push his food around and go to bed hungry sooner than eat what I burned, and he was pale and cross and cried easily. Addie did not coax him or fuss over him. She just set good food in front of him and ate her own and paid him no particular mind, and in a few days he was cleaning his plate and asking for more, and the pallor started to go out of his face, and he stopped crying at night. I noticed. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. Tom was the first of us to turn to her. I remember the exact day, because it snowed, the first snow of that year. A soft early one that didn't stick past noon but came down thick for an hour in the morning, and Tom had never in his short memory paid it any mind. But that morning he stood at the clean window with his nose to the glass and watched it fall, and then he ran to where Addie was working the dough and he pulled at her skirt and said, "Come see. Come see it snow." And she wiped her hands and went to the window and knelt down beside him, level with him, and the two of them watched the snow come down, and she told him some quiet thing about how each flake was different from every other one, no two the same in all the world. And Tom listened with his whole face, and I stood in the doorway with a load of stovewood in my arms and felt something turn over in my chest that I did not have a name for and did not want. My father came in from the cold in the middle of it, stamping the snow off his boots, and he saw them there at the window, the woman and his boy, heads together, and he stopped, just for a breath. Then his face closed the way it always closed, and he said, "That door lets the heat out," and went through to the back, and Addie rose and went back to her dough, and Tom went on watching the snow alone, and I set my wood down by the stove and would not look at either of them. That was how it went for a while. Addie warmed the house by inches, and the children warmed to her by inches, and my father stayed frozen in the middle of it like a stone in a thawing creek, the water moving all around him and never touching him. He was civil to her. He was never unkind. I want that understood. My father was not a cruel man, only a wounded one. But he kept a wall up so high and so cold that it was a labor just to be near him. He ate at the table with us now because she'd made it plain, gently and without a word of argument, that the children needed to see their father at a table, but he ate in silence and left as soon as he could. And if Lucy laughed at something Addie said, or if Tom crawled up into Addie's lap, I would see my father's jaw go tight, and he'd find a reason to be gone. I understand it now. I did not then. He had loved my mother the way some men love only once, all the way down, and when she died he had made a bargain with himself in the dark of his grief, that if he could not have her, he would have no one, and he would build a wall around the wound and keep it fresh forever, because to let it heal felt like letting her go a second time. And here in his own kitchen was a woman filling his house with warmth and his children with laughter, thawing the very thing he had sworn to keep frozen, and every good thing she did was a kind of accusation. Every time one of his children reached for her, it told him what he had failed to give them himself. A smaller man would have sent her packing to be rid of the reminder. My father was not small. He kept her on, and he let her heal his children, and he punished himself for it every day by standing outside the warmth she made, and I think those were the loneliest months of his whole life. Lucy turned next. It happened over the matter of her hair. My mother used to braid Lucy's hair every morning, and after she died no one did it, and Lucy's hair went to tangles and mats until I finally hacked at it with the shears one day and made a ruin of it, and she'd cried and I'd cried, and that had been that. It had grown out ragged and wild. One evening not long after the first snow, Addie was sitting by the lamp with her mending, and Lucy came and stood near her, not asking anything, just standing the way a shy dog will come and stand near a fire, and Addie looked up and set down her needle and said, "Would you like me to comb that out for you? It won't pull, I promise." Lucy didn't say anything, but she came and sat down on the floor in front of Addie's chair with her back to her, and Addie took up a comb and began to work the tangles out, starting at the bottom and holding the hair above so it wouldn't pull at the scalp, patient as anything, an hour of patient work. And Lucy sat there with her eyes half closed and her whole small body gone soft. And when it was done, Addie plaited it into 2 neat braids and tied them off with strips of cloth. And Lucy put her hands up and felt them, and turned around and looked at Addie with a look on her face I hadn't seen there in a year. "Mama used to do this," Lucy said. I saw Addie go still. She was quiet a moment, choosing her words the way you'd cross a creek on stepping stones. "Then your mama loved you very much," she said, "to take that care with you every day. You keep her braids, Lucy. I'm only borrowing the comb." And she never once, in all the time I knew her, tried to take my mother's place or dim her memory. She spoke of your mama always with respect, and she asked us about her, and she let us keep our mother whole and shining in our hearts. And I have come to understand that this was the greatest kindness of all the kindnesses she did us, that she did not ask us to trade one love for another, but only made room for a second one alongside the first. But I did not see that then. What I saw was my sister looking up at this stranger with soft eyes, and I got up and went out to the cold barn and stood in the dark with the horses breathing, and I was so angry I could have wept, and I did weep, and I hated her for it. And I could not have told you why the hating hurt so bad. Addie found me there. She'd come out to fetch something, or maybe she'd come out after me, I never knew. She didn't make a fuss of it. She just stood in the barn doorway with the lamp, and she saw me there with my wet face and my fists, and she didn't come toward me, and she didn't say she was sorry, and she didn't tell me not to cry. She said, "I lost my mother too. I never knew her at all. I don't have so much as a face to remember. You've got a whole mother to keep, Wesley. All her right there in you. That's a rich thing. Don't let anybody, me least of all, take a bit of it from you." And then she set the lamp on the nail by the door so I'd have light, and she went back to the house and left me be. I stayed out there a long time. When I came in, the house was quiet and the others asleep, and there was a plate set by for me on the back of the stove, keeping warm with a cloth over it. I ate it in the dark. It was the best thing I'd tasted in a year, and I cried again while I ate it quiet, and I was so ashamed of the crying and so grateful for the food that I couldn't have said where the one feeling ended and the other began. That was the night the wall in me started to come down, though I fought it a while longer yet out of pure stubbornness. The winter came on hard after that. The high country doesn't ease into winter, it slams the door. By the end of November the sweetgrass was frozen along its banks, and the wind came down off the hills with teeth in it, and my father spent every daylight hour and half the dark ones seeing to the cattle, moving them to the low draws where there was shelter, hauling hay, breaking ice on the water, working himself gray. There is a hardness to that country in winter that I have never found the words for. It will kill you if you turn your back on it. It killed my mother in its way, bringing the fever down out of the cold. My father fought it like it was a living enemy, and I think in his grief he half wanted it to take him too, so hard did he push himself out in the worst of it. Addie kept the house against the cold like a fortress. She had a way with the stove that stretched the wood and the food both, and she kept us in socks and mittens knit from raveled down old things, and she filled the long dark evenings, the sun going down by 4:30 and not up till near 8 with small warm things. Stories she made up, and songs, and games with buttons and string, and the teaching of Lucy her letters, and the settling of Tom to sleep with his head in her lap. The house that had been a gray cold shell became, that winter, without any of us quite marking the day it happened, a home again. And at the center of it, unmoving, sat my father when he was in it at all, a stone in the warm current, saying little, watching everything from behind his wall. I began, that winter, to warm to her against my own will. I couldn't help it. She was so steady and so kind, and she never once asked for a thing in return, not a word of thanks nor a scrap of the affection she poured out on us. I started staying in the warm kitchen in the evenings instead of sulking off to the cold barn. I started answering when she spoke to me. She taught me to play a game with a knotted string, and she found out I had a head for figures and set me little sums to work, and she asked me to read to Tom of an evening because my voice held him better than hers, she said, and that was a lie, a kind lie, to give me a place. And I knew it was a lie and I loved her for it, though I'd have died before I said so. And then in the deep of January, Tom took sick, and everything came to a point. It started as a cold, a runny nose and a cough, the kind of thing children get all winter, and Addie kept him in and dosed him with what she had and thought little of it. But on the third night the cough went down into his chest and his fever climbed, and by morning he was burning and his breath came fast and shallow with a rattle in it, and Addie's face when she looked up from his bed told me she was afraid, and Addie was never afraid, and that scared me worse than the fever. It was the same sickness. Not the very same, but a lung fever, a winter fever, the kind of thing that had come down out of the cold and taken my mother, and every one of us felt the shadow of that in the room, and none of us said it. My father came in from the barn and stood in the doorway of the little room and looked at his youngest boy burning in the bed, and I watched the year of grief come up in his face all at once, and for a moment I thought he would turn and walk out into the yard the way he had the day my mother died. His hands were shaking. Addie stood up from the bedside and faced him. She was a full head shorter than he was, and she looked up at him steady as a post, and she said, quiet so the boy wouldn't hear, "He is not going to die, Mr. Barrett. Not if I have anything to say about it, but I need you here. I cannot do it and keep the fire and the water both, and I will not lose this child for want of hands. Do you hear me? I need you here." I had never heard anyone speak to my father like that. I braced for the wall to come down like a hammer, but something in her voice, it wasn't hard, it was the opposite of hard. It was a woman asking a frightened man to be brave with her. Something in it reached him. He looked at her, and he looked at his boy, and the shaking in his hands went still, and he took off his coat and hung it on the peg and rolled up his sleeves and said, "Tell me what to do." We fought for Tom 3 days and 3 nights. The blizzard came in on the second day, the worst storm of that whole winter, and the wind screamed around the house and drove the snow flat sideways and buried the fences and cut us off from the world, and there was no thought of going for a doctor 40 miles off through that, and even if there had been, the doctor could not have come. It was us and the storm and the sick child, and Addie ran it like a general. She kept him propped up so he could breathe. She kept water going into him a spoonful at a time. She made a tent of blankets and had my father hold pans of steaming water under it to ease his lungs, hour after hour, through the nights. My big silent father crouched over his boy in the lamplight doing whatever the woman told him, and she laid cool cloths and warm cloths in their turns, and she sat up with that child every hour of every one of those 3 nights and did not sleep. And when the fever crested on the second night and Tom went out of his head and cried for our mother in his fever dreams, calling "Mama, Mama," Addie held him and rocked him and did not correct him, did not say "I'm not her," only said, "I'm here, I've got you, you're safe, hush now," and let him call her by the name that comforted him. And over the top of that child's fever-bright head her eyes met my father's. And I saw my father's face break. At last, all the way, the whole frozen year of it cracking open right there in that lamplit room. And he put his big rough hand on his boy's hair alongside hers, and the two of them held that child together through the worst of the night, and neither of them said a word. The fever broke near dawn on the 3rd day. I remember the moment. The wind had died in the night, and the world outside was buried and silent and just beginning to go gray with the coming light. And Tom, who had been burning and raving, went all at once quiet and loose, and Addie put her hand to his forehead and her cheek to his cheek, and she made a sound I will never forget, a sound like a rope going slack after it has held a great weight to the very edge of breaking, and she looked up and said, "He's cool. He's through it. He's going to be all right," and she began to cry, which she had not done through all of it, and my father, my hard, walled-off father, reached across the bed and took the crying woman's hand in both of his, and held it, and neither of them let go for a long while, and Lucy woke and crept in and climbed into my lap, and outside the sun came up red over the buried white hills, and the worst was over, all of it, the fever and the winter and the long frozen year, though we didn't know that last part yet. Tom came back to us slow after that, weak as a kitten for a fortnight, wanting Addie every waking minute, and she was there every minute, and something had shifted in the house that could not shift back. My father had crossed a line in that sick room that he could not uncross. He had been afraid, and she had been beside him in the fear, and he had done as she asked, and it had come out right, and a man cannot go through a thing like that with a person and keep a wall up between them, not a real wall, not anymore. It was still there, his wall, but there were doors in it now and light coming through the cracks, and he knew it, and I think it frightened him worse than the fever had. Because here is the thing about my father. The closer he came to caring for Addie, the guiltier he felt, and the guiltier he felt, the harder he pushed her away. It was a cruel machine, and he was caught in it. In the weeks after Tom's sickness, he went colder than he'd been all winter, not to us children, but to Addie. He stopped meeting her eyes. He'd leave the room when she came into it. He took to eating out at the barn again, alone, standing up. Once I heard him tell her in a voice like a door slamming that she'd overstepped, that Tom was his son to worry over, that she wanted to remember her place. And this after she'd sat up 3 nights and saved the boy's life. And I saw her face when he said it, and I saw that it cut her deep, deeper than she let show. And for the first time I was angry at my father instead of at her, blazing angry, 12 years old and shaking with it. And I might have said something I'd have paid for, except that Addie caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, let it be. And I let it be. And my father went out to the barn, and Addie went back to her work with her jaw set and her eyes bright, and I understood dimly that grown people could tangle themselves into knots a child couldn't follow. It was Lucy, in the end, who cut the knot. Lucy, who was 8, and who did not know there was any law against saying the thing that was true. It happened at the very end of February, on a bright, hard, cold day with the snow squeaking underfoot, and the sky a blue so deep it hurt. Addie had a bad day. I found out later she'd had a letter. The situation she'd left before hours had written to see would she come back. Better wages, a settled family, no gruff widower and no wall to batter herself against. And she was quiet and far off all that morning. And I think she was deciding, that day, whether to stay or go, whether there was any use in loving a family whose father would not love her back. Whether she'd let herself hope again, and be a fool for it, or gather her one bag and go on the way she'd gone on all her life. Lucy didn't know any of that. Lucy only knew that Addie was sad, and Lucy could not bear for Addie to be sad, and she went and climbed up in Addie's lap and put her arms around her neck and said, into her ear, but loud enough that the whole kitchen heard it and my father heard it, coming in the door with an armload of wood right at that moment. Lucy said, "Please don't ever go away. I want you to be our mama. Can she stay forever, Papa? Can she stay forever and be our mama?" The kitchen went dead still. My father stood in the doorway with the wood in his arms and the cold pouring in behind him and his face. I was watching his face. I have watched it in my memory 10,000 times since. His face did the thing it always did, started to close, the wall coming up. And Addie, with Lucy in her arms, looked at him over my sister's head, and she did not say a word. She just looked at him, and there was no plea in it and no reproach in it, only a great tiredness and a great tenderness. A woman who had been alone her whole life looking at a man who had chosen to be alone the rest of his, and asking him nothing, because she had long since stopped believing she had the right to ask anyone for anything. And my father looked back at her, and I watched the wall come up halfway, the way it always did, and then I watched it stop, and then I watched it come down. He set the wood down slow by the stove. He straightened up. He took off his hat, which he never did in the house until supper, and he held it in his 2 hands the way he'd held it that day in the yard a year and a half before, and he looked at Lucy, and then he looked at Addie, and when he spoke his voice was not the door-slamming voice and not the barn voice. It was a voice I hadn't heard out of him since before my mother died, low and rough and unsteady. "I've been a poor father to you children this year past," he said, "and a poorer man to you, ma'am, than you had any right to bear." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I told you the first day I'd not have your mother's place filled." This to Lucy, but his eyes were on Addie. "I meant it for a wall to keep out grief. All it did was keep out the only good thing that came to this house since we lost her." He turned his hat around in his hands. "I don't ask it lightly, and I'd not blame you a bit for taking the next stage as far from this cold place as it runs, but I'm asking, not for help kept, for," and here the big man's voice broke clean in half, and he had to stop and start again, "for you to stay, as my wife, if you'll have a grieving old fool and his 3 children. And if that's more than you can give, then to stay as our own however you'll have us. But to stay, that's what I'm asking. God forgive me for how long it took me to ask it. I've been at a great many weddings and heard a great many pretty speeches since, and I have never heard anything to touch that clumsy broken asking in a cold kitchen. A hard man laying down the wall he'd built to guard a grave, choosing the living over the dead at last, not because he loved my mother any less, but because he'd finally learned that the heart is not a thing you run out of." Addie was quiet a long moment. Lucy had gone still in her arms, not understanding all of it but understanding the size of it, and Tom had crept over and taken hold of Addie's skirt, and I stood by the woodbox with my heart going like a hammer, and Addie looked down at the 2 little ones holding onto her, and then up at my father, and she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were streaming, "I have kept 11 houses in my life, Mr. Barrett. I have loved a good many children that were not mine, and every one of them I've had to leave in the end, and I told myself each time it wouldn't hurt so much the next. It always hurt worse. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, quick, and lifted her chin. I made up my mind this morning I'd not do it again. I'd not let myself belong to a place I'd only have to leave. She looked down at Lucy and at Tom and at me. And then this one asked could she keep me, and I found I'd already gone and belonged whether I let myself or no. I've belonged to these children since the boy watched the snow. She looked back up at my father and the smallest smile came, watery and true. I'll stay. Not as help kept, I've been help kept my whole life and I'm done with it. I'll stay as my own woman freely, and as your wife if you're sure you want more than a housekeeper, and as these children's mother for as long as they'll have me, which I hope to God is forever. Yes. My answer is yes. And Lucy let out a whoop that rattled the windows, and Tom, not understanding but catching the joy of it, whooped too. And my father crossed that kitchen in 3 strides and stood before Addie not knowing what to do with his hands. And she stood up with Lucy on her hip and put her free hand against his rough face, and he covered it with his own and bowed his head down to it, this great hard grieving man, and I saw his shoulders shake. And I turned away to give them the moment because even at 12 I knew it belonged to them, and I found that I was crying too, the good kind this time, the kind that washes something clean. They were married 3 weeks later, when the roads cleared enough for the circuit preacher to come up, in our own front room with the bar cross folks and the Getsias for witnesses and Mrs. Pauline Getz crying into her handkerchief and saying she'd known it. She'd known it all along, though she hadn't. Addie wore the made-over dress. My father wore his one good shirt and could not stop looking at her. Tom fell asleep before it was over. Lucy stood up as close to the two of them as she could get, holding a fistful of Addie's skirt, and I stood by my father's side as the oldest. And when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, my father reached down without looking and put his hand on my shoulder and gripped it hard. And that grip said everything he was never going to be able to say in words, and I have carried the feeling of that hand on my shoulder my whole life. She was our mother for 31 years. I'll not draw it out. A man could fill a book with the good years, and it would only be the ordinary book that happy families write, and the ordinary parts are the whole of the blessing. She and my father had 2 more children between them, girls, my half-sisters, though we never once used that word in our house. We were all just Barretts, all one, and Addie would take a stick to anyone who tried to sort us out by whose we were originally, and no one ever did more than once. She never treated the 2 she bore any different from the 3 she took in, and my father, who had come to her a stone, thawed all the way through and stayed thawed, and grew into a warm and easy old man, quick to laugh, forever with a grandchild on his knee. And if you told a stranger that this was the same Amos Barrett who'd stood in a cold kitchen and forbidden his children to call a woman mama, the stranger would not have believed you. My father died first, an old man in his bed with all of us around him, and the last thing he did in this world was reach for Addie's hand, the way he'd first reached for it across a sick child's bed in the dead of a hard winter, and she held it till the end and after. She lived 9 more years. She never once in all that time let us feel we'd wronged our first mother by loving her. She kept Ruth Barrett's memory bright in our house to her own last day, spoke of her with love, made sure the little ones who never met her knew whose blood ran in their oldest brother and sister. And I have come to believe that a woman who could love us that generously, who could make room in a family for the dead and the living both and never grudge the sharing, was the finest soul I ever knew or ever will. I am an old man now in a warm house, with children of my own gone gray and grandchildren I lose count of, and I built all of it, the whole warm crowded life of it. On the foundation, a penniless orphan woman laid in a cold kitchen when I was 12 years old and would not so much as meet her eye. She came to us with 1 bag and no family in all the world, and she went out of this life leaving behind the biggest family in the county, every one of us hers. And if that is not the richest thing a person can do with a life, then I do not know what riches are. Lucy asked, That bright cold day, could she stay forever? She did. She stays yet, in every warm room I've ever sat in since, in every child I ever tucked in the braids my granddaughters wear and the bread I still can't make as well as she did, and the particular way I have of watching the first snow come down and thinking, no two the same in all the world. She stayed forever. She is staying still. And when my own time comes, and I hope it is soon, for I am tired and the house is quiet, I mean to find her and my father and my first mother, all three, and I mean to tell them that I understand it now, all of it, the wall and the thaw and the great wide-open generosity of a heart that will not run out. And I mean to thank the gray woman who walked 4 miles up a cold road carrying everything she owned, and found a family that would not have her, and stayed until she made it her own.